Welcome to Wealthy Women Warriors Tribe Thrive, helping women and workplaces go from impact to, idea to impact without burning out. This show empowers women and workplaces with learning and development to transform culture with impactful action. Today's topic is socialized behaviors that trigger implicit bias and microaggressions, how to change workplace culture from within. And I'm joined by two incredible women who I have developed deep respect for their work, their missions, and the impact that they are making on workplace culture. I'm honored to host Kami Anderson, an interculturalist, scholar, and language advocate. She holds a bachelor degree in Spanish from Spelman College, a master's degree in international affairs, interdisciplinary studies in international communication and anthropology from American University, and a PhD in communication and culture from Howard University. Woo! Dr. Kami Anderson is the founder of and CEO of Bilingual Brown Babies, and creator of a revolutionary online program that meets Black families where they are in their journey to bilingualism. She's a passionate, lifelong teacher and a go-to girl when it comes to language, Blackness, and identity. And her counterpart, Dr. Joy L. Wiggins, who received her doctorate from the Ohio State University in multicultural education and social justice. She's the founder and the CEO of Joy Wiggins Equity and Inclusion Consulting, which provides speaking, facilitation, and mentorship opportunities on the topics of power, privilege, racial and gender justice, and liberation. She spent the last 20 years working on understanding how cultural identities and perceptions of how we navigate through the world create our cultural identities. Based on her talk in 2017, it was a TEDx WWWU talk. She and Dr. Kami J. Anderson wrote From Sabotage to Support, a new vision for feminist solidarity in the workplace, which is now available on Amazon and is actually the basis for our three-part discussion today. Thank you so much for joining me, ladies. So what sparked this is one of my colleagues actually sent me your book, and I dove in. I got super excited. The content, the history, the transformation of what's possible in the workplace. And when we break down the individual socialization, microaggressions, and even white woman violence, which is a topic that we don't necessarily talk enough about, these are the topics that are so vast. And for me, when we first started talking, I got so excited that I realized really quickly that this couldn't just be one episode, which is why this is the first of a three-part series where we're going to be diving into those three topics. So individual socialization, microaggressions, and white woman violence. And today we're kicking off with the individual socialization. So please be sure to watch all three. In this episode today, we're going to talk about who we are as women, who we are as ethnicity, and who we are as gender. And in this episode, we're going to dive deep into the scripts we've been using and how to examine how to flip that script and create one that works for you. Welcome, Kami and Joy. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Yeah, so exciting. So let's dive into this because, we've now had a couple of conversations. Our first, what I found so amazing with both of you was that we got onto an informal call. We sat down and it was like instantly there was just all of this chemistry because of the work that we have done and the three backgrounds. And then the three of us got together and it was fascinating because it was like bringing all of these elements together. And one of the first things that we explored really was looking at, what does it mean to be a woman in today's society and in our workplace? Because not only do we have gender, we also have ethnicity, and then we also have ageism. So we have all of these elements that are intertwined. And your book does such an incredible job of diving in to the gender and the history. And I think that's one of the pieces that we're missing a lot of. Because if we don't understand the history behind why something is the way it is, there really isn't almost an awareness to think, well, does that still fit within the cultural norms that we're experiencing in today's society?
Yeah, I would. That's one of the things that Joy and I talked about a lot in the book. This whole idea that there's this assumption that we all have the same history. That because I'm a woman and you're a woman, that means we've all had the exact same experiences. And I raised it, yeah, but I've got an extra little layer that's on there. Joy has an extra layer that's there than not all women have. And what does it look like to be able to acknowledge that difference as opposed to the similarity? I think the similarity is where a lot of the disconnect came in, even when we're looking at just the various feminist movements. The reason why we have so many waves is because people were not acknowledging the differences. They only wanted to see the similarities. So being able to have that understanding of who we are uniquely and not collectively is important to really dive into what exactly has been our experience as women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. What I was going to say was, if you don't mind, Kami, if you could just talk a little bit about your background and your history, and then let's explore this. And then, Joy, I'm going to turn the conversation over to you, if you don't mind.
So I am obviously a Black woman, but I was raised by a single mother who had me at 19. Mm-hmm. So there are stereotypes that are associated with that, right? When you're the product of a teen mother. So the baggage that I carried being the product of a teenage mother, and what some assumptions that people had with how I had to kind of walk through life. But I was also, and I excelled in academics, and I excelled in the things that I was interested in, which was considered an anomaly for the stereotype of the product of a teenage child. Mm-hmm. And being able to understand that, when I put my head to something, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to get. Going to HBCUs for college, going to PWIs, teaching at PWIs, all of these different things have an impact on how I see the world, because I see the world based off of my experiences of all of these things, from the little girl who had her Catholic teachers give her sweaters because they felt sorry for her, all the way to the one that beasted out her oral defense at Howard. All of those experiences mean something to who I am and how I see the world. So I see very differently. I don't assume certain things about people when I meet them, because people assume so much about me. So I'm not going to assume who you are until I talk to you, because I know that people had a lot of assumptions about me when I was growing up. I guess that's probably the best example I can give.
And even just the awareness. I think that's the thing that most people have to adopt, is an awareness of where we're coming from. So the awareness that you had was that you had so many assumptions, so many stereotypes that were placed on you, that is something you are acutely aware of whenever going into any situation where you're meeting someone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
For sure. And Joy, what about for yourself? Let's dive into your background, how you got started and everything that you're doing, and even like the conversation about, who you are as your unique story.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons why Kami and I connected so well in Madrid is that we both felt like we were that our voices, our experiences were slightly marginalized, and that there were voices and experiences that we had experienced growing up, traveling so much to different countries, but also me being a queer woman and Kami being Black, and we could see that in this intercultural communication seminar there was a very white centering happening. But also it was around, study abroad students and how they might come in and learn about a different culture and dive in. And we just felt like there were some gaps there. And so I think that for me, my experience as being a military brat, moving constantly, we moved every 2 years. I lived in Germany, I've lived in China, and it was, I could see the world, and I could see the world broaden at a very young age. And so I think being able to see all of that, and also being in the military, seeing the rank and status of how, who would salute to whom, I could see power very clearly. Our neighborhood was set up to where the majors were in the front of the neighborhood. They didn't have as nice of houses. And then as you go back, the generals' houses were at the end. Sure. So it's very clear how to see power. And so when I started to study at Ohio State and really look at cultural identity and anthropology, I realized that of course, of course there's power, of course people, and even as a woman having my first job at 15, being sexually harassed, my very first job, and being fired because I wouldn't give in to the manager. I could see how, yes, very clearly, power plays a huge role. And then as I started to have more and more conversations with people, especially seeing, as we were writing the book and seeing the history of the feminist movement, how so many waves have happened because women's voices were marginalized. And so how with each wave, we're introducing more and more previously marginalized voices and perspectives. And like, oh, you hadn't thought about, how immigration now and what's currently happening with immigration and the separation of families is directly affected because we haven't been having these conversations. We haven't been putting the immigrant experience in the middle of these feminist conversations. And so I think, and also with environmental justice and looking at the Native populations and how, we are facing a climate crisis. And the Native voices have been saying this for years and years.
For years and years.
For years and years.
Years.
And so it's a crisis, and it's been a crisis for a long time. And I think sometimes white folks are now just realizing what a crisis things are when folks of color have been saying this for so long, for centuries.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because from my background, I mean, I grew up and everyone would look at me and think, you're the quintessential white woman. You've got blonde hair and blue eyes. You've likely had everything handed to you. And that would be the assumption that everyone has made about me. And yet, I grew up, I was first generation Canadian. And, the poverty that we experienced and the, amount of challenges that we went through and the proving that we fit in to this empowered white person culture and still in different elements have to conform to, and yet realizing that, wait a second, is this something that we need to conform to? And is this something that, we want our children to have to experience and go through? And, it's a crisis, but it's not necessarily taken as a crisis.
And I think adding on to that, the layer of, because, like being able to have those experiences and understanding what that marginalization means, and then to have that, and then also have ethnicity or race as a part of what that means. And it's like, okay, so yeah, you know the class side of it, but then there's also these other racial things that happen too. And I think a lot of times we try to go, I've had this experience, and it's like, yeah, but don't dismiss the fact that there's a whole lot happening,
Right. That's right. And I think that's the elementary aspect that we need to look at. That's where the foundation comes from. Again, it goes back to, who we are as women, and we're not just cut from the same mold. And because of that, and because the workplace has changed, society has changed, there's so much connection that is now available. And yet, because of that, and because of how digital technology has allowed for workplaces to change and for topographies to change and cultures to change, we haven't been able to get to a place where we've kind of allowed things to get messy. And the messiness is really where we start to explore, wait a second, I didn't realize this about this next layer. Wait a second, I didn't, understand this from this perspective. And without these discussions, we actually can't get to the elements that are crucially important for workplaces to thrive. And what we know is that workplace environments are more toxic than they've ever been. That's what the studies show.
Yeah, and I think part of that has to do with workplace culture does not allow for us to get messy. Everything is got order, there's policies, there's procedures, there's routines, all of this stuff is set in place. There's no space for messy. So at some point we have to be able to adjust and adapt the workplace culture to make sure that we're allowing for the mess to occur. It's kind of like being that type A personality and then you have kids. Raise your hand.
And then you realize, oh my goodness, the world doesn't
Right.
revolve around me.
You know, the type A can only work so far. The type A is in your bedroom and not necessarily in the common areas.
Yeah,
that's such a unique experience too. I think being a mother, you know, that that you start. I think for me, like, you know, thinking about motherhood too, is that not only, you know, workplaces can't get messy, you know, because the structure is not allowable for that. And I really think that if more women were in charge, then the collaboration and the messiness would not seem so daunting, and it wouldn't seem so unusual, and it wouldn't seem so stressful and overwhelming. But it actually, you know, as women, we deal with messiness all the time. And I think as soon as we do become a mother too, that also adds another layer of that. And you realize, like, how do I multitask? How do I figure out all of these different things? How do I look at the dynamics of children's personalities? And so it's almost like your employees, or, you know, people that you work with. And not saying that they're equating them to children, but I think that it helps, you know, like children. And so, and it's like the way that you talk to people. I think as a mom, I know that I've just become much more stronger. You know, having a 9-year-old now, like I've become much stronger in the workplace. And I also don't have time for unnecessary stuff either. And I think there's a shift sometimes that happens.
Yeah, and I think that piece of not having time for it is also part of what's kind of fueling what's happening in the workplace. Because if you look at it, you know, there hasn't been the room or the space for compassion, for empathy, for people saying or making mistakes without immediate repercussions, or instead of making a mistake and having someone say, hey, do you realize that isn't actually okay in this space?
Yeah, we save it for the performance evaluation, but after that, a whole year has gone past.
That's
so
right.
They don't remember what's happened.
Yeah.
And I think that's where that whole idea of being able to shift even just the workplace culture to like space for that. Because if we keep running with this mother metaphor, yeah, we're the type A personality, but if your child spilled something, you're going to say, hey, weren't you running with that cup?
Yeah.
This is why I tell you not to run in a house. Or what I tend to do with my children, and then they slip and fall. Did that hurt? What were you doing just before you fell? And asking those questions in the moment.
Think about that in the moment.
In the moment, just so able to, but you have to make that space. And me, because I am that type A person that now has 4 children, that is looking at my house sometimes like, but I know that they're in the moment. I have to say, hey, your job is to load the dishwasher. What are we gonna do about this spoon right here? I know. But if you do it now, then you won't have to worry about me asking you to wash everything all over again later. It's okay.
Yeah.
You can be mad at me.
And it's the same for and same analogy in the workplace. Analogy in the workplace, right? If you want to get this report in and you've realized that you've just left out this entire section because you didn't want to talk to your male-female counterpart because they're not going to give you the content that you need because of all of the other backstory that's happened. And then you're going to submit this and we're not going to have the right report. And then I'm going to have to deal with this situation that's happening here.
It's like, what makes more sense, to take this temporary pain or to deal with the residue that's actually probably going to ripple out? Deal with the pain now or deal with all of the ripples, because there'll be multiple things that'll happen if you don't address it right now.
Well, and see, this is the problem. Like this is the element that has been happening within the workplace because, you know, I don't know if you guys have seen the recent studies. I'm sure that you have. 90% of women's initiatives are volunteer-based programs. So when we look at what's happening in North America right now, and you look at women needing to have women's initiatives within the workplace, 90% of those are a second job that a woman has taken on because, hey, we need to check this box. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with mental health. Mm-hmm. So, and we're looking at burnout, and we're looking at all of the things that are happening because women are taking on so much. And then you look at, that 1% difference between the male brain and the female brain. And the female brain burns up way more energy because of emotional elements. Mm-hmm. And then you look at the toxicity in the workplace. No wonder there's 4 out of 5 of the people that are burning out are women. Right. Mm-hmm. You're doing 2 jobs.
Burning out and literally making ourselves sick.
And literally making ourselves
sick, trying to take all of this on. But then I think that goes back to your initial question, like how we're socialized, when we don't know each other's history. And right. I mean, something as simple as, hey, breast cancer runs in my family should give somebody enough pause if they have that compassion, that empathy, to be like, let's not make sure you're too stressed, because I know that the energy of being angry and worrisome and all of that stuff can contribute to a lot of ways in which cancer develops in your body. So let's make sure you don't have that much stress. And it's small. I'm not going to ask you to be on this committee, even though I need a woman. You're the only woman. I'll just ask you if you're willing to look over our recommendations and offer critique of our recommendations after the committee meets. That's something very different than having to go in every week for 2 hours at a time in order to be able to talk through and hash out recommendations. Let me just see what you got. Yeah, nope, these aren't going to work. And this is why. You all go back to the drawing board and fix that.
That's right.
That's a totally different responsibility. We don't have to feel the same level of stress and burden.
Yeah. And delegation is not something that women have as part of our script, is it?
Mm-hmm. Well, the system has told us that we're not supposed to. The minute we delegate out, we're showing our weakness. That's right. What the system has told us. We're weak if we delegate. You can't take charge. You can't do this on your own. And that mythological trope of the superwoman that Black women bear a huge burden of, that whole myth that we have around that is, hey, you're supposed to do it all. So no, don't delegate, because the minute you show that somebody else is doing this, that's not showing that you have power. That's showing that you can't handle it. Mm-hmm. And we internalize that, and that's how we move through stuff.
And I think that's that's a different narrative too that we wanted to talk about in the book, is that maybe perhaps that's not always recognized in the workplace. Mm-hmm. Is that there's that extra layer of burden that Camille is facing because of the history and because of the backstory and the legacy that we have left, especially with American, history with slavery and then civil rights, and knowing all of those things and how that affects us today. And then I talk to my students about the legacy of white privilege that I've had and why I'm able to have the opportunities that I've had now. It's not based on just my hard work. A foundation was already set. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that that's really important. And when we look at education, the other thing that my students are facing a lot of is anxiety. And, the millennials and and Gen Z right now have a lot of anxiety. And a lot of it's because they have this huge amounts of student loan. And so once they come into the workplace, they have different challenges than we did as Gen Xers. Mm-hmm. So that's another thing to think about. And what we really wanted to talk about in the book was that everyone is facing something different, and some of it is more serious and more violent than others.
Right.
So for people of color, it's a much more violent history that they're facing and still facing now with police brutality, and also the intersections of race and class. And that's really important to understand that particular aspect. And so there is this different layer. So me as a queer woman, yes, there is violence and there is discrimination against queer people, but it's not the same. Right. And not, and as a white woman, I still walk with privilege, and there's still assumptions that people are making about me that would be different for Camille. And I think, and as you talk about too, Camille, about epigenetics and how things through time have affected our actual DNA structure, right, that also makes you more susceptible. Black women in the healthcare system, there's much more childbirth related deaths for Black women than there are for white women. And so when someone's in the workplace and they are pregnant and they're a Black woman, they are facing something much more crucial that maybe their white counterpart does not understand.
Right. And there's also, even and using that as an example, because I know, like, again, I have 4 children. I was pregnant while I was in the workplace. After the birth of my first child was very much medical microaggression, and trying to deal with that, plus the healing of it. And I was a new mom, and I was at work, and I'm teaching, and I'm doing all of this, but I can't tell you that I'm having a hard time, because me telling you that I'm having a hard time is going to give you the impression that I'm not fit for tenure.
So let's talk a little bit about it. So this is such great conversation and such great highlights here. Let's talk a little bit about flipping the switch and what that means on changing some of these scripts, and on looking at, in each of these episodes, really what our goal is to be able to bring 3 solutions, because I think we've done a lot, and your book does a lot to uncover, the history and the issues that are happening. I feel like the issues are finally coming, and I feel like 2020 is going to be the year where things really start to get messy, because unfortunately workplaces are starting to recognize that they can't get away with what they have been getting away with. It's not just a box, and people are being called out on it now, and women are starting to call them out on it now. So in order for us to be able to move things forward, and I always like to look at it like we're bridging the gap. This isn't a male versus female. This is, let's bring people together. Right. Let's bring the genders together. Let's bring the races together. Let's bring our ethnicities together. Like, let's look at this as a together problem. And in order for us to do that, we really do have to look at the scripts that are happening in our own minds. So, when you talk about, this is the script we've been given, and all of us will have our own internal scripts, and we're currently following those scripts. Let's talk a little bit about breaking the script and breaking into writing the new one.
Well, one of the things that we have to do is because we were saying that there's not space for compassion in the workplace. We have to make that space. Even if it's a 20-second conversation while you all are getting coffee in the break room, find out something that's going to give you a little bit more insight into what that person is bringing with them every day to work. That's really important. Like, being able to not just like, hey, how you doing? And just keep walking, but stop and listen to their response. If their response is saying they're fine, but you notice that they're spilling everything in the kitchen, hey, I know you said you're fine, but I've never seen you spill this much stuff. Are you sure you're okay? And leaving and having the space to be able to have that conversation. This is not necessarily, but we have to be careful, because we've also been socialized to hold on to stuff as ammunition for later. This is not what this is for. This is genuinely learning about the person that you work with in the cubicle, office, whatever, next to you every day, in order to make sure that you both are more productive at work. So that the places where you can advocate when that they're clear that they might have some apprehension about having that self-efficacy. What can you do? What do you know that can help you make sure that you stand in the gap for them? Take that time and make that time to be able to make that happen is one thing that you can do.
And I think too, it's, you have the individual level, and then you have the structural level. And so what are the leaders doing to create a structure that community of trust has been built, and that there's a foundation so that when new employees come in, that they are actually creating this foundation of trust, and that there's community building happening. And I always say this, like, as a former 6th grade teacher, I told my students that are pre-service teachers now, I'm like, you need to take a first month of your classroom, just forget about academics and just build a community. Build that community of trust, talk about community agreements. How do we work out conflict? How do we talk about our problems? How do we trust each other? How do we start to think about ways in which we can support each other? And that time invested absolutely helps in the long run, because it provides people that foundation for that when something does come up and there is a problem, it's already been addressed. It's been preempted. It's already been addressed. And so how do we do that structurally? So that when we have those individual conversations, we're not worried that that person that we're confiding into, because we're shaking around in the kitchen, they're not going to use that later. Right. Or, when in a hallway, if someone's being nice to you and you think, oh, they're my friend now, they're being nice to me. And it turns out like they didn't have your back the next week in some meeting or something like that. And they completely, what you might feel like, threw you under the bus or abandoned you when you thought, well, I thought we had that conversation in the hallway. I thought we were good. We can avoid things like that by actually getting real with each other from the very beginning. And that's where the leadership has to come in and create that space.
Right. Absolutely. And it starts with the job announcement, not the interview.
Exactly.
It does start with the job announcement for sure. And I think even from there, it's like knowing if the leadership team is not aligned. That's the other thing that I see a lot of. I see the people at the top where they say, these are the values that are important to me, but they're important to them as an individual. They're not important to them as a collective whole. Right. And so when you don't align the values of what you're then going to show up in the workplace with, an organization cannot be healthy. And it cannot be healthy because those values and the behaviors that are caused through the values are not in alignment with what they're trying to generate. And that's really where that workplace culture, the toxicity, comes in. Because if you don't have leadership on the same board, you might have one person, and it can't just be one person. And what's happening more and more is that one person is typically the female leader who is then meant to be the mother figure to all of these other people.
And other mothering is a whole other thing in the workplace.
And that is a whole other thing in the workplace. That's right. That's right. So I think it's about getting really clear and really consistent about what that trust looks like. What does it look like to be compassionate? What does it look like to be empathetic? What does it look like to take a moment and actually understand that you're a human being? I'm a human being. We're having human experiences. And yes, we don't just come to work and put on our work capes. We bring everything that's happening with us into that work day. So, I think what I've heard with our takeaways from our individual session is that, who we are as women is very unique. We're all different. Who we are as an ethnicity needs to be talked more about, because those elements of what our history is have not only changed how we think, how we see the world, but it's also changed our DNA. It's impacted the epigenetics, just as Kami has said. And then when we're looking at creating the script for ourselves, what does that look like? What does the script for ourselves look like?
Yeah, I think, we talk about that in the second part of the book. So the book goes from sabotage to support. So the first part is really talking about implicit bias, the history, our socialization. And then the second half is really looking at empowerment and solidarity and liberation. And so that piece around the solidarity or the empowerment to solidarity is, if we don't first empower ourselves and look at the negative messages that we've gotten throughout our lives, as from the time we were little girls, and looking at the difference between pink and blue and the toys that we were given and the ways we were socialized around friendships and what access we had to opportunities in our educational experiences, to the choices that we made based off of those things. Then if we start to really take a good lens, a microscopic lens to that, and say, okay, I have had no wonder I have chosen the path I have chosen. Look at all these messages I've got my whole life. And also that need to prove ourselves. And Camille, I feel that as far, when you talked about having to prove yourself because your mother was a teenage mom, I think that really investigating those aspects of ourselves and our experiences and assumptions that were made about us that weren't true, but that we also had to feel like we had to combat that. So really taking a good look at all of that. And then saying, okay, so what's the script that I want? This was the script I was given. What's the script I want? And what is true about me? And when we can figure out what is true about me, and then I get to decide, what? I had ADD as a child, and I also had a thyroid condition. So I was in a fog for most of my childhood. I didn't do well on tests. And so I just thought I wasn't smart. And I started to realize, wait a minute, not until I was like 40s and I got thyroid medication could I figure out, like, oh my gosh, I can think, I can move, and this is great. And that's what helped me to get to realize, like, I had this potential all along. I just didn't know what was happening in my body that was not allowing me to reach that potential. So that's one thing. So really looking at our health and looking at our history and looking at all the aspects that create that script for us growing up, And how do we then say, okay, what are the things, the steps that I can do to make myself healthy, to make sure I get access to the opportunities, to change that messaging, that message that goes in our heads, that negative self-talk? And how do I also not just prove to other people that I can do it, but really take that internally and say, okay, I know that I can do this. And I know that I have the wherewithal to be a leader and to see the change and be the change that I want to see in the world. I know that I could do that. And it's a constant daily struggle, I think.
Yeah. And I think that's absolutely. And I think that's the thing that we need to really look at as well, right? Is that this isn't, you're going to do this once, you're going to hear this once, you're going to read this book once, you're going to go into the workshop or you're going to go into the workplace and you're going to have this training once. Right. That is the element that we have to stop doing. Yeah. And we have to start making this part of our daily practice. And I call it practice because it is practice. We're not going to get this perfect. It is going to be messy. We are going to have all of, and it's funny because, you know, I'm sure with you ladies as well, you probably get that, oh, well, you work in this field, so you probably have this all figured out. No, but we're aware that every single day that we're going to have our negative thoughts, we're going to have our negative self-talk, and we're going to choose that the script that we were given isn't the script that we live by. And it's not the workplace that we're going to live by either.
Yeah, and I think that's self-awareness. Self-awareness is a foundation for the empowerment. If you don't have the self-awareness, you don't have the empowerment, and you can't skirt over that. You have to get all the way in there.
That's right.
So thank you. Right.
That's right. Well, thank you so much, Cami and Joy, for such a riveting conversation on individual socialization and how, as a woman in the workplace, we can flip the script and begin taking action for new cultural changes. Thank you, listeners, for being here on Wealthy Women Warriors Tribe Thrive. Please join us in the next episode of Socialized Behaviors that Trigger Implicit Bias and Microaggressions, how to change workplace culture from within. This is where we're going to be talking about microaggressions, so you're going to want to tune in. We're going to talk about what it is. We're going to talk about how to interrupt the meta-narratives that we were just essentially talking about, and we're going to move into how to shift some of these things so that you can believe in yourself and start to make that impact in the culture that you're wanting to. We'll see you in our next episode. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.